to answer questions. And with me this evening is Pat Stagner and Karen, my wife. And we are just going to start talking about some biblical topics. And if you have questions or comments, feel free to send those in. And we will try to address any questions that come up. And we would love to have a conversation with you about what we're going to be talking about. So I thought tonight we would start our conversation over in Micah chapter 2. The kids and I were reading, actually all of us, were reading through our reading plan, and we came through Micah chapter 2. And at the beginning of chapter 2, it's interesting some of the things that the prophet writes about. And so in Micah chapter 2, he says, "Woe to those who devise wickedness and work evil on their beds. When the morning dawns, they perform it because it is in the power of their hand. They covet fields and seize them, and houses and take them away. They oppress a man and his house, a man and his inheritance. Therefore, says the Lord, against this family I am devising disaster from which you cannot remove your necks. You shall not walk haughtily, for it will be a time of disaster." And so he goes on. But when he's at the beginning, he's talking about people who are doing what we would call injustice. He says they devise wickedness and they work evil on their beds. And it seems to be, it's what they dream about. It's what they think about all the time. Even when they go and they lay down. You know how sometimes you think about things at night, and that's maybe where sometimes you get some of your best ideas? Well, their ideas are about how to hurt people, how to do wicked things, how to do evil. And evil maybe not in the sense of like the devil evil, but evil in the sense of bad. They're going to try and hurt people. So I thought this would apply or be applicable maybe to our culture and our time in the sense that he's talking about injustice. And we see that talked about a lot. We hear it talked about a lot, especially lately. People talking about injustice, whether it's somebody suffering injustice personally, whether it's systemic injustice, but this concept of injustice. And we see here a prophet saying that's not right. Right? So there is this sense in which we ought to feel and loathe injustice. So what do you all think about that?
Well, it's certainly a topic right now. And, as you look at what is justice, and you and I were talking a little bit earlier, is justice is not necessarily just letting justice happen. It's being proactive about it. And as Christians, we're to esteem the other person above ourselves. And, I think if you go back to that principle that Jesus taught us, of to esteem others above yourself, then a lot of the injustice is the root of the injustice is taken away, because you don't have people that are scheming against each other and are looking to do harmful or unjust things to other people, because they're not looking to cause them harm. They're looking to esteem themselves like they would themselves.
Yeah. Karen, what do you think?
I was distracted by children. That's all I can say right now. I thought that was a great answer.
Well, it really is interesting, because when you think about, we ask all the time, what is the meaning of life, or questions like that. And as a believer, the meaning of life is to be faithful to the Lord. It is one way that you might answer that question, to be faithful to the Lord in all things. And he calls us to be people who are just. And I like the way you worded that. It's not, justice isn't a negative thing. In other words, it's not that I didn't do evil, so now I'm just. It's something that you actively do. It's a positive thing. You have to be doing justice. It's interesting that later in the prophet, it's in Micah chapter 6, he says, let's see, in verse 6, so Micah 6 and verse 6, with what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? So they're trying to fix a problem. The Lord has indicted them at the beginning of chapter 6, and this is the response, the people's response. What can we bring? What sacrifice can we offer? What burnt offering is really going to make up for all the sins that have been committed? 1,000 rams, 10,000 rams, or 10,000 rivers of oil. I mean, just these crazy things that will be suggested. And then in verse 8, you get this question, or you get this statement: He has told you what is good and what the Lord requires, to do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with your God. And so there's this sense in which the way that you are faithful to God is to do those things. Some translations will say steadfast kindness. So there'll be three things that are mentioned: to do justice, to have steadfast kindness, and to walk in humility. And all three of those things are things that you do. Sometimes we might think of Christianity as a bunch of stuff that you don't do. Well, we don't do this, and we don't do that, and we don't do this. And that it's not that those thinking that way is wrong necessarily, but that's a very negative approach. And I don't mean negative bad, I mean negative as in not doing things. Whereas if you take this answer, it's interesting when the question is posed, what shall we do? God doesn't start saying all the things you don't do. He tells you what you ought to be. These are the things that you should be doing. You should be doing justice, you should be showing kindness, and you should be walking or living in humility. And so I like that answer. Justice is something that you do. So what do you think it means to do justice? How do you do justice?
Well, there's a verse that says, to him who knows the good that ought to be done, I'm kind of roughly quoting it, but the good that ought to be done and does it not, to him that is sin. If that is the wrong thing to do, you know something that ought to be done, then you do it. That's doing justice.
Yeah.
And, we typically think of justice as what is right. That's kind of how we think about justice, as what is right. And, you turn it around is, the golden rule is, what is the golden rule and what is right? What would you want to be done to you? What kind of justice would you want others to show you? And if you can identify what justice you would want shown to you, I would want people to treat me fairly. I would want people to treat me with respect. I would want people to be honest with me. I would want, people to be, charitable and friendly. And I would want people to treat me like that. So if that's how I want to be treated, if I treat others that way, then I will be doing justice.
Yeah. There's, in the Deuterocanon, so if you ever look at a Catholic Bible or like an Orthodox Bible, there will be some extra books in there. We call those they call those the Deuterocanon, or you might hear people call them the apocryphal books. In one of the apocryphal books, there's a quote, and it says, "The evil that you hate, do to no one," which is kind of the negative approach. But then when Jesus talks about it, like y'all mentioned, when Jesus talks about this concept, Jesus doesn't approach it in a negative sense. That golden rule or the golden principle or whatever you want to call it over in Matthew chapter 7, what you want done to you, go do it to people. And so again, it's this positive thing. It's not a list of stuff that you don't do. It's not, it's not that, well, I would really hate it if somebody walked up and punched me in the face, so I just won't punch anybody, and now I'm good. Jesus, I think, would argue, it's great that you didn't punch anybody, but you're not good because you didn't do goodness. And until you are actually doing goodness, you're not good, in the sense of you're not being what the Lord wants you to be. And so I think y'all are right. James has that pretty powerful statement. Jesus says something that's pretty powerful. This idea of being just requires action, requires that we do something. And I think there's another really cool passage or cool verse. You can go all the way back to Genesis 18. I really like it when every once in a while where God kind of explains why he does things. He doesn't have to explain anything to us. So I kind of like it when he does. And so over in Genesis 18, he's about to go pass judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah. And he's kind of reasoning through there. He's like, I need to tell Abraham what's going to happen. And because I've chosen him and these blessings are going to come through him. And you really kind of see Abraham's character here. And in Genesis 18 and verse 19, it says, I have chosen him that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised. And so when we think about this great person in history, Abraham chosen by God to do these amazing things, God chose him for the purpose of teaching his children to do righteousness and do justice. So even from the beginning, right, this isn't a New Testament concept. This is something that God has always expected his people to do justice. And when we start looking then at the law and some of the other things you see, if you were a wealthy landowner, if you owned land at all, you were expected to leave the edges of your field ungleaned. If you had a vineyard, you were not allowed to harvest what fell. The reason why is so that people who were poor could have food to eat. And so there's this sense in which that is something that you are doing. All the work that you have put into growing your crops, you are to give that to other people. And you can see that in the book of Ruth with Boaz. When Ruth comes and is gleaning, Boaz actually has his workers. You can see him do justice there. He didn't just leave the edges of the fields or leave what fell, which they weren't allowed to pick up. He actually said, cut things for her and set them in a pile and let her have those. That's what he did. He did justice. And so when we think about, well, what does this mean for me? It means that if you see somebody who is down, you should help them up. If you see somebody who has been hurt, then you should heal them. And so it requires action. And there's always this downward looking. Not that somebody has less value, but they may be in a lower station or a lower situation. If you have something that you can share, it's expected that you share it. And so Jesus will say over on the Sermon on the Mount, if you have 2 tunics, share one, right? That's kind of the idea. His teaching there really isn't radical. His teaching, well, I guess technically it would be radical because he's going back to the law. That was justice in the law. If you have and somebody hasn't, you should help them. And it's just a different way to live than I think our culture calls us to live. What do y'all think about that?
Well, I was just looking at Matthew chapter 25. In Matthew 25, Jesus is saying, and the king will say to his, come you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. And the righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry, or feed you, or thirsty, or give you drink? When did we see you a stranger, invite you in, naked, and clothe you? And when were you sick that we came to see you? And the king will answer and say, truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me. So every act of kindness, when we see an opportunity to help someone in a situation that they need help or justice, if you want to call it that, or being that is what we are called righteous when we do that. The Lord calls us righteous by doing that, and that righteousness is our faith acting to do what will give justice and give assistance to someone that is needing it. And as we talk about all this injustice right now, if that principle was more in place, that people were living that rather than looking at, what's wrong, if they were looking at a proactive way to be that, I think we would be in a better situation.
Yeah.
That's what Christ told us to do. And everything that I just read, that might cost you something. It might cost you money to give someone food or to help them out. The Good Samaritan, he spent a lot of money on that man.
Mm-hmm.
He spent a lot of money on that man, but he was willing to help him.
Yeah. Somebody he didn't know. It's a
total
stranger.
I think it was, the equivalent of like 2 weeks' wages or some. I may have that wrong.
It was a lot of money. Yeah.
It was a lot of money.
Yeah. And
We're told, okay.
go ahead.
I was gonna say, we're told to weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. And that fits in with like all the things that we're told to do, just to love people.
Mm-hmm. And it's also kind of interesting when you look at the sense of charity. Christianity was fairly unique. I mean, Christianity has vastly changed culture to the point where I think if we could get in a time machine and go back to the ancient world, I don't think that we would recognize the culture. It would be like a foreign world to us. We couldn't comprehend the way that people treated one another. The casual way in which human life was spent. I mean, just it was nothing in some places to just kill people. And so when you kind of go back, it's difficult for us when we read through this text to think just how different what God is saying all throughout the scriptures, how different that was from the world that surrounded these people. You kind of get a feel back in Genesis where you have Lamech in Genesis 4, where he has the song of the sword at the end of Genesis chapter 4 about how somebody made him upset, so he kills them. And he sings a song about it. And so this idea of doing good to people instead of taking advantage of them, it was a pretty foreign concept. And the idea of giving, where you, in Acts chapter 2 and 3 and 4, where you just see the church just giving and helping and loving one another, that's pretty radical too. Somebody selling their property and bringing all the money to the church and distributing that money. That is a sense of justice. I have, and these people don't. So I'm going to take what I have and spend it on them. You can see this in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. This is where I was going with this. Where Paul is talking about this gift that the Corinthians have promised. He makes a big deal in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9 to make sure that they understand that this is not commanded of them. He isn't demanding that they send this gift to the needy saints in Jerusalem. But he is going to kind of present this in a sense of justice without actually using that word. He's going to talk about in chapter 8, like in verse 8, he says, I don't say this as a command, but that you should prove by the earnestness of others that your love is genuine. So this love that we have, people who are coming to be like Christ, should cause us, if we have something, to share it. And he'll use Jesus as an example in verse 9. You know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, for you he became poor so that you could become rich. Jesus spent himself on us. And in this matter, I give my judgment. This benefits you, who a year ago started to do this work and desired to do it. So now finish doing it so that your readiness in desire will be matched by completing it. And again, he's not saying that you have to do this, but as we become like Jesus, sharing what we have should become what we do. It's who we are. And then in verse 13, he says something that's interesting. He said, I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened. In other words, he doesn't want them to switch places. But as a matter of fairness, your abundance at the present time should supply their need so that their abundance may supply your need and that there is fairness. And the word fairness there, we might want to say like equality. And so there's this idea of the Corinthians are reaching down to the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem, and they're pulling them up. And the way he words this is pretty neat. That the Corinthians have an abundance of goods. The Hebrews, the Jewish Christians, have an abundance of need, and so they both share with the other. And the two separate abundances kind of cancel each other out, and they will have equality, fairness. So he brings this forward as a justice issue, that here are people, your fellow believers, who are starving and they don't have food, they don't have clothing, they need your help. You have a bunch, you're very prosperous. You should share with them. And he'll later, and over in chapter 9, he'll use the example of gathering the manna. He'll say, he who gathered much had none left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. Well, how does that work? If we're all gathering manna, and I gather a bunch of it, and you get almost nothing, what's the only way that I can have nothing left over? Well, I guess there's two ways. I could eat it all, or I could share with you, and then both of us get what we need. And so it's just interesting that that's how giving is presented to the Christian community. It's a justice issue. And it's something that we do not because we're commanded to give money, but because we are just people. We do justice. And when I know that there is a need, if I can help, I should. What do y'all think about that?
Well, with Christians, I mean, he's just asking them to treat each other like family. You would do that for your family. So your Christians are your family, so you do that. But even beyond that, even with people that you may not have the same fellowship with, you are to still, like you're saying, to do justice and to show that love to people who do not yet know Christ, that they may know him, because then you will be shining that light and showing the good works that God's light would be reflected in the world. So like Matthew 5:16 said. So there's a purpose there that brings people to know Christ because of the love, the justice that you're doing, even though it may be undeserved.
Well, and you look at, if you look in Galatians 5 at the fruit of the Spirit, the list there is kind of a really good checklist for, you could fast forward, or you could call that justice, is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And all of those, if, whether you're talking about supplying someone's needs, or whether you're talking about how you treat someone, how you oppress them, how you treat them in the workplace, how you treat them as a neighbor, how you see them as a person, any of the social injustices that are being talked about right now, if those principles are in place, those injustices shouldn't be. As we talk about, what color does God see when he looks at us? God does not see color when he looks at us. He looks at us as all of his children, and he doesn't see that. And we should be the same way. We shouldn't see nationalities. We shouldn't see color. We shouldn't see, man or woman. We shouldn't see any of that. We should see just another soul that God loves and Christ died for. And that is justice.
Yeah, and it's such a part of early Christianity. I think the closer you get to the early Christians, which is why books like Acts are important, because you see the early Christians, what did their faith look like? The closer you get to early Christians, the better idea you get of who Christ was showing people to be. Because as things spread out, not really talking about that right now, but kind of as things spread out and time goes on, things kind of get changed, and you see a lot of variation all over the place. But as you work backwards, one thing that seems to be consistent is this sense of charity. Like we might use the word charity, or justice. There's an emperor, a Roman emperor. His name is Julian, and he wrote this. He wrote it to a high priest, a pagan high priest. He said the impious Galileans, the Christians, is what he called them, Galileans. They support not only their own poor, but ours as well. And all men can see that our people lack aid from us. Teach those of the Greek faith to contribute to public service of this sort, and teach the Greek villages to offer their first fruits to the gods, and accustom those who love the Greek religion to good works by teaching them that this was the practice of old. So here's this Roman emperor. He's looking out over his people and his religion. We would call him a pagan. And he's like, what's the matter with us? Why are the Christians going around And the Christians are taking care of all the poor, not just the Christians who are poor, but also the Romans who are poor, the Greeks who are poor. He's like, why are they doing that and we aren't? And so he would actually, this emperor would actually go and tax people, and he would try and fix it by taxing people and distributing goods from the government. And we fall into the same trap. It didn't work then. It didn't work for Julian. He was trying to snuff out Christianity and kind of boost the old Greco-Roman religions, and it didn't work because Christians do it personally. You know, I as a believer in Jesus, I cannot rely on the government to do my charity for me. The government is going to tax me, and whatever the government wants to do with the taxes that it gathers from me, that's the government's business. I really can't control that. But at the same time, I can't say to myself, and I think this is a trap that we fall into sometimes, I can't say to myself, oh, well, I pay taxes, and the taxes do good things, so now I don't have to. I'm not doing justice, if that's kind of my thinking. And what Julian tried to do is Julian tried to fix the lack of justice among his people by taxing them and then distributing that money. It didn't work. It didn't change the people. And as a believer, I'm not trying just to bring social or economic equality. I mean, those are great things, but I'm trying to change somebody's heart. I want to change the person. I want to help them come to know Christ. I want them to change who they are, what they do, why they do things. And for that to happen, that requires me to be in their life, me to do justice, me to be out there sharing and helping. And so the government's going to take a big chunk of our money, and the government's going to do with it whatever the government does with it. The Christians in the 3rd century, 3rd, 4th century, who are being taxed by the Roman government, they didn't say, oh, well, the Roman government took some of our money and now they're distributing it to everybody, so we don't have to help anymore. They kept doing it. And that's one of the reasons, not the only, that's one of the reasons why Christianity became so successful, is because of this idea of doing justice. So I think it was Pat who said it earlier, if we would do this, it has an amazing effect on people. It helps to not only bring people back to equal footing, which is the biblical sense of justice, but it helps to show people God's love. It helps to bring them back to their Savior, to their God. Does that make sense? Kind of thinking about those things?
And I think it's noteworthy that you said that, talking about the Emperor Julian, a pagan emperor noticed.
Yeah.
He noticed what the Christians were doing. It did not escape his. It was significant enough that he noticed it. And he even said, we should be doing that.
Yes.
And that's exactly what Christ, when we're told to be a light in the world. And that is how we can show people that Christians are different, and that it should be apparent to a non-believer that these people are different. And he went so far as to say, we should be doing what they're doing. Now, he didn't get the approach correct, but he realized that his people needed to be acting that way. And what was missing from the equation is they didn't have Christ. They didn't have Christ at the core of it. But that's how we as Christians, we should be seen as being that different from everybody else, that it stands out.
Yeah. And there's even a difference in the reason that it happens. Like the ancient world was weird in the way that they had things set up. Like they had a patronage system, which doesn't really translate over into like employee-employer. And so it wasn't set up exactly like our culture is all the time. But if you were wealthy, you would be a patron, and when people came every day, you would give them money, and then they would be there to serve you. Like they would go to the store for you or do things and run errands or do whatever. And then they depended on you to feed them. You know, you were the kind of their income. And all of this was done to increase your reputation. Like you as the patron, the reason why you took on other people, the reason why you gave patronage was so that you could become uh, more well known, so that you became more famous or bigger in the culture. And it's interesting that when it comes to Christianity, the giving is never done to increase the giver's reputation. Right? That's not why it happens. In fact, the one time that we see this in the Bible where the givers are trying to maybe increase their reputation is with Ananias and Sapphira over in Acts chapter 5, where they sell a field and they save some of the money back, and then they come and they bring the part that they want to give, and they give it to the apostle Peter, and they're like, hey, we sold the field for this much. And they wind up dying. They're killed because they lied. And so
It didn't work out.
No, it didn't.
It didn't work out.
Greg, what do you think?
I think what she thinks.
Yeah, so it's just interesting that it's different from the way that the world does things. Like a lot of people will donate money, like at Texas A&M. I don't know if it's got a name yet, but at Texas A&M, if you give enough money, they'll name a building after you. And people don't give millions of dollars to Texas A&M just because they sure do love the university, at least not generally speaking. They give this money so they can get their name plastered up on a building. It increases their reputation. Now, not everybody does that. Some people, I'm sure, just really love the school. But, I mean, that's kind of like a perk. But as a believer, I don't help somebody else so that they will feel indebted to me. You don't help somebody else so that one day maybe they'll name a church building after you. That's not the point. The point is that there is injustice. Somebody is low and we are higher, and we want to even that out. And it is that equaling, that fairness that Paul talked about. That's the point. And when that fairness happens, when somebody who is in an unjust situation, when they are lifted up, that's the reward. That it's just who we are. And so it's a different motivation. And again, another Roman emperor, Marcus Aurelius, he wrote a series of writings called his Meditations. And he said, to roughly paraphrase some of his works, was to do good for the sake of goodness, which we have kind of morphed into Santa when we talk about do good for goodness sake. That's Marcus Aurelius. And so that was his ideal. He looked around at the world about him and he said, we should do good things just for the sake of goodness, because he saw that Romans were only being kind to one another when it increased their reputation. There's constant infighting and bickering to get a better political position. And he's like, guys, we should be doing the right thing because it's the right thing. And then when you look over at Christianity, that's exactly what Christ teaches, to do the right thing. In Matthew 25, that passage you mentioned, Pat, when Jesus turns to the righteous, all that means is that he turns to the people who did the right thing. And that was clothing the poor, feeding the hungry, visiting those in prison, taking care of people. And you can't legislate that. Right? Marcus Aurelius tried, Julian tried. You have to change hearts. And I think actually this is a good thing right now in our culture, because this idea, this sense of, this crying out for justice, this crying out for doing righteousness, those are biblical principles. And if we can show people, hey, this is what Christianity has always been about. You finally figured it out. Come, let's show, come and see. It's a big opportunity because people are finally realizing that they want what Christ all along has been telling us, what God all along has been telling us. Any other thoughts or any thoughts about that? Or about something else? It doesn't have to be about that.
Well, it's kind of a sidebar to it, but the result, or one of the results of all of that within us is peace. And that's another thing that our culture is needing right now is peace. Whether it's peace within yourself, peace with your neighbor, peace with your country, your government, peace. But that peace starts within you, and that's I think one of the benefits that we can also show people is, whether you're talking about what's going on now with coronavirus, or you're talking about whatever's on the news today, you have a sense of peace within yourself, that that God is in control. What do I need to do today? What am I called to do today as a Christian? What can I do? And if we're all asking ourselves that, what can I do? The collective of all the people that ask themselves and do, what can I do? That makes a difference. And that collectively makes a difference in communities, in nations, in churches, in families. Pick a group. If you start with, how can I serve the Lord today? And what can I do to answer Christ's call? Then, think of how different things would be. And the peace that you have from knowing that, this is how Christ treated me. What we're being called to do, everything that we've talked about is what Christ did for me. He's treated me with more than justice. He's treated me with more than fairness. He's treated me with what I didn't deserve. And because of that, then I have the opportunity to show that same mercy, that same grace to other people.
Melanie Hill said, "Great point, Pat." I did just saw it, so I don't know if she's talking about what you just said or maybe something previous, but at some point she really liked what you said.
Hi, Melanie.
And Marcia Hunt referenced Matthew 6 about being careful not to do your righteousness to be seen by other people, and I think that's a great point.
That's a great point.
It's different. We do it. Christians do the right thing for a different reason. We don't want the acclaim. We don't want prestige. We want justice. We want things to be right, and that should be good enough. We do right for the sake of righteousness, and that's it. Yeah. Glad you're back, Karen.
Had a little crowd control.
Yeah. That is all that I have planned on talking about. I think we covered it pretty well. Did y'all have anything else that you wanted to talk about? And no is an okay answer.
I'm thinking. I had something else I was going to talk about and it slipped my mind.
Let's see.
Silence.
Yeah. Well, we'll just go ahead and wrap it up. We've been going for about 40 minutes or so. I feel like we did a pretty good job talking about justice, at least the basic principles of what God expects. And so we'll just leave it there. And if you happen to remember what you want to talk about, now we have a topic for next week.
Okay.
Which is always a good thing. Just want to say thank you, Pat and Karen, for being here with me tonight. It's always more fun when there are people to talk with. And thank you for everybody who joined us online. And we'll be back next week, same time, 7 o'clock on Friday.